Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight and next week, I shall be discussing a psychological issue of the most profound importance. It is an issue which I can, in this course, treat only very, very briefly, an issue which I treat at several times the present length in my course on basic principles of objectivist psychology. And I refer to the psychology of self-esteem, to its role in human life, its significance in understanding human motivation, and its relevance to mental health. Now, that man has a need of self-esteem is implicitly recognized by virtually everyone. That is, almost anyone knows implicitly, rather than explicitly, that what one thinks of oneself, how one evaluates oneself, is an issue of the most immense importance psychologically. That to have a good opinion of oneself is an issue of extreme importance to men, and that men will evade to tremendous lengths anything which would affect or shatter their good opinion of themselves. Yet, no one has ever asked the question, what is self-esteem and why does man need it? Is it really a need? If it is, why? What is the nature of the need? Why is this issue so important to man? Why should it matter to man so much what he thinks of himself? Now, to demonstrate that self-esteem is a genuine psychological need, one must demonstrate that it is required for man's survival and well-being qua man, because that is what a basic need means. One must show that in some way the issue of self-esteem is tied very directly to man's survival and well-being. That is, to his efficacious continuation of the life process. The needs of any given organism are determined by the specific nature of the organism in question. And if we are to see that self-esteem is a need of man, we must look to the question of what are the facts of man's nature which could give rise to a need of self-esteem. The answer lies in remembering and applying in this context three crucially important facts about man's nature. The first of these is that man is a rational being. That is, a being whose distinctive mode of coping with reality is his conceptual faculty. Man is a being able to conceptualize. The second of these points, closely allied to the first, is that reason is man's basic means of survival. The third is that man is a being of volitional consciousness. What are the implications of these facts for our present concern? Well, consider the following. First and most basically, man's survival, insofar as it depends on his action, depends on the correct use of his mind, on the correct use of his consciousness, on the proper exercise of his rational faculty. To live, man must think. His life depends on it. But to think is an act of choice. No animal faces this problem. An animal's only problem is the physical environment suited to him or is it not? If it is suited to him, the animal lives. If not, the animal perishes. But provided the animal lives in a physically compatible environment, the animal is guided by its pleasure-pain mechanism and by its senses automatically to pursue the course which will protect its life. An animal cannot act against its own senses or fail to use them. but man can act against or defy or fail to use his mind. Thus, for man, the problem of survival is primarily psychoepistemological. Remember that by psychoepistemology we refer to the science which studies how man uses his consciousness, the cognitive operations that characterize a man's method of using his consciousness. And when I say that the problem of survival for man is psychoepistemological, what this means is that man's survival most crucially depends upon him functioning by the correct psychoepistemological method of functioning. There are three fundamental psychoepistemological alternatives that man faces, more basic than any others. The first of these may be called, or summarized, the alternative of consciousness versus unconsciousness. What do I mean by that? I mean that the most fundamental psychoepistemological choice is, will a man function on the principle of seeking constantly to be aware of that with which he is dealing? Will he function on the principle of always seeking to expand the range of his awareness, to expand the range of his consciousness, to exercise his rational faculty to the utmost? Or will he succumb to a lethargic mental passivity and seek to get by on as little mental effort as possible, spending the better part of his time in a sort of psychoepistemological coma, in a mental fog, without direction or mental purpose or effort being exerted? The second fundamental psychoepistemological alternative is reason versus feelings, by which I mean, will a man always be guided by the utmost conscientious, disciplined exercise of his rational understanding, or will he suspend his rational faculty and drift instead at the mercy of his feelings, letting his feelings decide for him what is true or false, or right or wrong, or what he will or will not do? Third, the issue of intellectual sovereignty versus intellectual dependence, meaning, will a man always rely ultimately upon his independent judgment? Will he accept the responsibility of exercising independent judgment, or will he instead again suspend his consciousness and pass on to others the responsibility of judging and knowing reality, and attempt in effect to exist as a parasite on their consciousness, letting them decree and guide him in matters of truth or falsehood, right or wrong? Now, it's important for you to notice that all these three alternatives really entail one basic issue, namely to think or not to think. These three alternatives are what, in fact, the choice to think or not to think actually means. Such are the basic facts which you need to understand and to remind yourself of in order to understand the nature of man's need of self-esteem. Very early in his development, man discovers that he has to make choices, that in dealing with reality he constantly has to choose. Shall I do this or shall I do that? If he makes the right choice, he will succeed. If he makes the wrong choice, he will fail, he will suffer pain, he can even die. His life and happiness depend on him being right. He has to choose constantly, he has to make decisions constantly, and the extent to which he chooses right, other things being equal, will be the extent of his success and happiness. If he chooses wrong, instead, the consequence is pain, frustration, failure, defeat, destruction. Therefore, clearly, man has a survival need to be right. Does this mean that man has to be omniscient? No. Does this mean that man should demand infallibility of himself? No. Clearly, this is impossible. What does man require? He requires the knowledge that he is right in his method of making his choices and decisions. Meaning, he requires the security of knowing that the method behind his choices and decisions, the mental processes which give rise to his choices and decisions, are right, are reliable. Man's competence to deal with the facts of reality depends on the rightness of his mental operations in dealing with reality. That is, his competence to deal with the facts of reality depends on the rightness of the psychoepistemological principles that his mental operations characteristically exhibit. Does he characteristically function on the principle of seeking constantly to expand his knowledge and understanding? Does he characteristically function on the principle that his rational judgment must never be subordinated or sacrificed to a feeling, to either a wish or a fear? Does he characteristically function on the principle that he will accept and regard as knowledge only that which he genuinely understands with his own mind? These are the issues upon which the psychoepistemological rightness of his mental operations basically depends. These are the mental operations that precede and lie behind his choices and his decisions to the extent to which he's rational, and thus give him maximum advantages in the struggle for survival, make him maximally or optimally fit or competent in dealing with the facts of reality. But the rightness of his psychoepistemology, the rightness of the mental operations that characterize his method of dealing with the facts of reality are not automatic. Man must achieve the right psychoepistemology. It represents a volitional achievement. And therefore, man faces a question that confronts no other living species. He faces the question, have I made myself into the kind of entity that is fit for survival, adequate to deal with reality? Am I competent to live? Am I efficacious? Have I achieved the psychological state that my life and well-being requires? Am I right for existence? That is, am I able to live and worthy of living? Am I able to live and worthy of living? That is the basic question that man faces. Because the state of being able or competent to live is not automatically guaranteed to him, except as a potentiality which he must actualize, man confronts the question, am I able to live? And because the state of being competent to live must be achieved by him volitionally, man confronts the question, am I worthy of living? Have I done that which my life requires? His need of the certainty that he is able to live and worthy of living is man's need of self-esteem. Why is self-esteem, that is, the conviction that one is able to live and worthy of living, a basic psychological need? It is because efficacy is a matter of life and death to man. His life depends on his ability to deal with reality, to know what to do. It is in the nature of a consciousness that the collapse of its efficacy is the ultimate horror. a horror no other catastrophe could match. Man's deepest fear is not of dying, but of being unfit to live. In order to act, man needs the conviction that he knows what he's doing, that he's able to act, competent to judge, competent to decide. Moreover, since life consists of pursuing values, he requires the conviction that he is worthy to enjoy values. In order to pursue values, man must value the beneficiary, namely himself. A being who damned himself as totally and irrevocably worthless would have no incentive and no will to pursue values. He would be unable to answer the question, what for? Yet the ability to answer that question is for man a matter of life and death. The issue of worthiness and the issue of efficacy are inseparable. One cannot feel inefficacious but worthy, or evil but efficacious. The sense of worth proceeds from the knowledge that one has made oneself able to live, that one has done what one knows to be right. Self-esteem is the certainty of the efficacy of one's consciousness and the worthiness of one's person. The task of a rational morality, among other things, is to offer man an integrated code of values which will teach him that he makes himself worthy to live by making himself able to live. That is, that by exercising his rational faculty, by exercising his mind, he at once makes himself competent to deal with reality and makes himself worthy of enjoying life. And one of the most evil consequences of conventional mystical morality is precisely that it gives man a contradictory code of ethics which places the requirements of efficacy and the requirements of worthiness in opposition to each other, so that to the extent to which you use your mind, are productive, and are concerned with life on earth, that is, to the extent to which you make yourself efficacious, you're morally unworthy by conventional mystical ethics. The extent to which you relinquish your mind and act on faith and self-sacrifice, and thereby are declared to be virtuous, the extent to which you make yourself worthy, you make yourself incapable of dealing with reality. This, in philosophy, is the deadly split between the moral and the practical, which the altruist ethics forces upon man by offering him a code of values which cannot be practiced, which cannot be lived on earth, which leads only to suffering and self-destruction. One of the purposes, therefore, of a rational code of ethics, of a pro-life code of ethics, is precisely to show man how he makes himself worthy to live by making himself able to live, by making himself into a being competent to deal with reality successfully. Self-esteem, as I have said, is the certainty of the efficacy of one's consciousness and the worthiness of one's person. And the ultimate expression of the failure to achieve it is the passive psychotic, staring vacantly into space, lost in an unnameable dread, unable to act or to function, needing to be cared for and fed by a keeper, frozen by a self-pronounced verdict of worthlessness, paralyzed and imprisoned by the most lethal of contradictions, a consciousness turned against itself in doubt, in guilt, in terror. How does the child first encounter the issue of self-esteem? The child's first awareness of the issue of self-esteem is not in terms of the issue of life and death, but rather of pleasure and pain. That is, the question, do I know how to deal with the facts of reality? Do I know how to choose right? Presents itself in terms of the issue of pain or pleasure. Do I know how to succeed? Do I know how to make myself happy? Do I know how to avoid pain? Do I know how to avoid suffering? But every young child, very early, in the early years of life, begins to come up against the question of his own efficacy or helplessness. Which means the question, am I able to achieve my values? Or am I impotent in the face of reality? The child's first self-generated pleasure in life is the pleasure of achieving efficacy as it learns to move its body, to gain control over its limbs, to stand, to walk, to manipulate objects, and observe the universal delight that children exhibit in this process in the very early ages of turning themselves into efficacious beings. At this level, significantly, there is no split between the able and the worthy. The pleasure and the pride which the young child takes in the first steps of growing efficacy are experienced as an indivisible unit inside his mind and emotions. As the child develops, as he passes into the conceptual level of consciousness, he comes up against the fact that to think, to function on the conceptual level, requires an effort. And so he comes up against the basic alternative referred to earlier, the alternative of consciousness versus unconsciousness, or consciousness versus non-effort. Shall he exert his mind or not bother? Subsequently, he comes up against the alternative, reason versus feelings, wishes or fears. He knows that something is right, but he has an emotion pulling him to do the opposite. Does he go by his mind or does he go by his feelings? The child doesn't know, of course, and indeed most adults don't know it consciously, that only rationality can lead to self-esteem. But he doesn't need that particular discovery in order to be rational, because no one can escape knowing that one should be rational, meaning that one should be conscious, that one must know what one is doing, that contradictions do not exist, and that one must not indulge oneself in contradictions. What self-esteem requires, in simplest terms, is rationality, by which I mean, 1, commitment to full understanding as one's highest value, meaning commitment to the principle of constant mental growth, of awareness, of seeking always to expand the range of one's awareness. 2, commitment to the principle that nothing can be higher or more important than the facts of reality, that there is nothing to which the facts of reality or one's perception of the facts of reality or one's judgment of the facts of reality may be sacrificed. 3, the conviction that all of one's convictions, values, and actions must be validated and justified by a process of thought, a process of reason. 4, full acceptance of the responsibility of judging, of looking at reality and judging, true or false, right or wrong. 5, commitment to the principle of always acting in accordance with one's best rational understanding, of living up to one's convictions, of accepting the principle that one acts on that which one's mind tells one is right. And from the foregoing, you can appreciate, again, the disastrousness of an anti-life, anti-man code of ethics, which is so incompatible with the requirements of man's life on earth that the only way to be moral is to turn yourself into a being absolutely unfit for life on earth. And the only way to be practical is to stand damned morally. I refer you to an article which I wrote some time ago for further details on this subject, an article which was originally printed in the Objectivist newsletter and then reprinted as a pamphlet. The article is entitled Mental Health versus Mysticism and Self-Sacrifice. And in this article, I'm specifically concerned to show why the ethics of mysticism and altruism are incompatible with mental health and self-esteem. Now, what I want to draw to your attention is that the fundamental issue of self-esteem is psychoepistemological, that the basic issue of self-confidence is psychoepistemological, that the basic issue of moral rectitude is psychoepistemological. When I say that self-esteem is the conviction that you are right in your method of dealing with reality, I want to stress again, I am not talking of omniscience nor infallibility. I'm talking about the fundamental principles that characterize your method of choosing and decision-making, which processes lie behind all of your actions. It's the conviction that you're right in principle, not that you'll be concretely right in every particular choice you make. What do I mean by being right in principle? For example, and most basically, not the conviction that you will never make a mistake, but the conviction that you will never act without trying your best to know what makes sense, without trying to know what is true and right. That you will never act on the principle of, I don't need knowledge, I don't have to know what I'm doing, I can just act blindly. Again, not the conviction that you will never err or miscalculate, but the conviction that, whether you are right or in some cases wrong, you will act on the best of your rational understanding and you won't smother it in order to indulge some irrational emotion. That is what I mean by being right in the basic principle by which one functions. To summarize what I have said, self-esteem, the conviction of one's efficacy and worthiness, is man's deepest psychological need. In briefest essence, the basis of this need may be summarized as follows. Reason is man's basic means of survival, and the exercise of his rational faculty is volitional. Since reality confronts him with constant alternatives, man must choose his goals and actions. His life and happiness depend on his making the right choices, that is, choices which are consonant with the facts of reality and with the requirements of his own nature. Man cannot demand omniscience or infallibility of himself, but he does require the conviction that his method of choosing and making decisions, that is, his characteristic manner of using his consciousness, is right in principle, appropriate to reality. An organism whose consciousness functioned automatically would face no such problem. It could not question the validity of the mental operations which lie behind its actions. But to man, who is a being of volitional consciousness, this question is of life and death concern. Man is the one living species who is able to reject, sabotage, and betray his means of survival, his mind. Man is free to exercise his rational faculty or to suspend it, to act in accordance with his best, clearest, and most conscientious judgment, or to act against it, moved by blind feelings, to preserve his intellectual independence and integrity, or to surrender in parasitical fear to the authority of others. Thus, man is the one species who must, by volitional effort, make himself into an entity that is able to live and worthy of living. His need of self-esteem is his need to know that he has succeeded at this task. To think or not to think, to focus his conceptual faculty or to inactivate it, is a man's basic act of choice. The one acts solely and directly within man's volitional power. An unbreached determination to use one's mind to the fullest of one's ability, an unbreached refusal ever to place any other consideration above one's perception of reality, is the only rational criterion of virtue, the only justifiable standard of moral perfection, and the only possible basis of authentic self-esteem. This, in briefest essence, summarizes the major points made so far. If you want to concretize and to see very clearly what these abstractions mean, why, you cannot do better than to look at Miss Rand's fictional characters, because you will see dramatized very, very clearly the principles I have been discussing. The enormous self-esteem which her heroes and heroines exhibit is very directly and very clearly a consequence of their basic method of mental functioning. It's very interesting that although the concept of psychoepistemology was only coined by us several years ago, what's fascinating is the extent to which that theme is very much in evidence both in The Fountainhead and in Atlas Shrugged. When Rourke is struggling early in The Fountainhead to grasp the basic principle that differentiates himself from the Dean, he's in fact struggling toward what is in fact a psychoepistemological concept, the first-hander versus the second-hander. As I pointed out in a recent article on psychoepistemology, the basic conflict in The Fountainhead is between two psychoepistemologies, the independent mind versus the dependent mind. And, as I said in the same article on psychoepistemology, this is brought out still more explicitly in Atlas Shrugged. It's very interesting, if you want to give yourself an assignment, to reread Atlas Shrugged strictly from the point of view of psychology in general and psychoepistemology in particular. And many of you may be amazed to realize in how many ways the basic issue of good and evil is set up in what you will recognize as psychoepistemological terms, namely, the way the heroes and the heroines function mentally and the way the villains do. James Taggart is a beautiful example. There are any number of references to the internal corruption of his mental processes, the evasions, the blankouts, the constant anti-effort. It's very significant how James Taggart is first introduced into the story. Do you remember? "Don't bother me, don't bother me, don't bother me," said James Taggart. That's very, very significant, psychologically. And in contradistinction, pro-effort, a tremendous commitment to the use of their minds, a commitment to rationality, a commitment to intellectual purposefulness, is, of course, the trademark of the heroes in Atlas Shrugged. Think of Reardon, in whom this issue is dramatized to the fullest extent. Think of what you are being told in Chapter 2 about Reardon's past and his development. Think about the scene which I referred to in that same psychoepistemological article when Reardon learns about the passage of the Equalization of Opportunity Bill. Think of what Galt means when he tells you in Galt's speech, "The noblest act you've ever performed is the act of your mind grasping that 2 and 2 make 4. What's that but a psychoepistemological issue? You would benefit a great deal, to repeat, if you would take a look at Atlas Shrugged from the point of view of these issues. And I think you will see many new things in the book which perhaps you haven't noticed on preceding readings that will be reciprocally illuminating. These lectures will make the book offer you new things you hadn't noticed before, and in turn the book will cast additional illumination on these lectures. Now then, it needs hardly to be said that the great majority of men do not function consistently as rational beings and do not achieve full self-esteem. Now, the alternative is not, as you know, exhausted between the man who is consistently rational and the man who is consistently irrational. Both are minorities in any culture. The great majority of men are rational some of the time and irrational some of the time, have some self-esteem and a good deal of guilt and self-doubt. James Taggart on the one hand and Galt on the other both represent minorities. Indeed, even that James Taggart has to be rational some of the time. Perhaps the only examples of consistent irrationality are to be found either in insane asylums or in graveyards. The reasons why man needs self-esteem dictate the standard by which self-esteem is to be gauged and the necessary conditions of its attainment. To the extent that a man fails to attain it, the consequence is a feeling of anxiety, insecurity, self-doubt, the sense of being unfit for reality, inadequate to existence. Anxiety is a psychological alarm signal, warning of danger to the organism. Pathological anxiety, neurotic anxiety, that seemingly causeless fear of which so many people complain and from which they suffer at least some of the time in their lives. In varying degrees of intensity, the experience of such anxiety is the fate of most human beings. Most men never identify the importance of reason to their existence. They do not judge themselves by the standard of devotion to rationality, and they are not aware of the issue of self-esteem in the terms in which I have been discussing it. They are aware only of a desperate desire to feel confident and in control, and to feel that they are good in some basic way which they cannot name. But the cause of that formless fear and guilt which haunts their lives is a failure which is psychoepistemological, a failure in the proper use of their consciousness, a default on the responsibility of reason. The anxiety they experience is part of the price they pay for that default. And here we speak of the great mass of people, not all of whom are grossly neurotic, not all of whom are institutionalized, just the people perhaps who are over-reliant on sleeping pills, who run out to too many occasions because they can't bear to be alone, who long to be emotional dependents or to be dependent upon, or who run from one meaningless sexual affair to another, or who choose any one of dozens of possible neurotic pseudo-escape routes by which they try to smother an anxiety they cannot ever entirely escape. Since self-esteem is the fundamental need of man's consciousness, since it is a need that cannot be bypassed, men who fail to achieve self-esteem, or who fail to a significant degree, strive to fake self-esteem, to evade their lack of self-esteem, and to seek protection from their own state of inner dread behind the barricade of a phony self-esteem, a pseudo-self-esteem as I call it. What do I mean by the concept of pseudo-self-esteem? To begin with a definition, pseudo-self-esteem, an irrational pretense at self-value, is a neurotic device to diminish anxiety and provide a spurious sense of security, to assuage a man's need of authentic self-esteem while allowing the real causes of its lack to be evaded. Ladies and gentlemen, if you wish to understand a man's basic motivation, if you wish to understand the root of the values and goals that direct a man's behavior, the most fundamental question you have to know the answer to is, what is the nature and degree of his self-esteem or lack of it? Or putting it another way, what is the nature and degree of his self-esteem or of his pseudo-self-esteem? Because this holds the key to his motivation. A man can seek to maintain his pretense at self-esteem by two basic means. One, he can evade and repress ideas and feelings that could affect his self-appraisal adversely. That is, he can simply try to blank out anything which would suggest that there's anything wrong with him, and therefore hurt his self-esteem. And secondly, and very significantly for understanding neurotic motivation, he can seek to derive his sense of efficacy and worth from something other than rationality. That is, he can seek to derive his sense of efficacy and worth from some alternative value or virtue, which he experiences as less demanding or more easily attainable, such as doing one's duty, or being stoical, or altruistic, or financially successful, or sexually attractive. And this complex process of self-deception on which the neurotic builds his life holds the key to his motivation, to his values, and to his goals, as I shall show you. To continue our discussion, one of the most, perhaps the most basic distinction or differentiation between the psychology of a man of authentic self-esteem and the psychology of a man of pseudo-self-esteem is the following. In the psychology of a man of authentic self-esteem, there is no clash between his perception of reality on the one hand and the preservation of his self-esteem on the other hand, since he bases his self-esteem on his perception of reality and on the fact that he holds no value or consideration above reality. But to the man of pseudo-self-esteem, reality, to some extent, appears as a threat, as an enemy. He feels, in effect, that it's reality or his self-esteem. Why? Because his pretense at self-esteem is necessarily purchased at the cost of evasions, of self-deception, of things he refuses to see, of some areas of blindness. And this is why a man who may be perfectly rational and lucid in one area that doesn't happen to touch or to threaten his pseudo-self-esteem can be flagrantly irrational, evasive, defensive, and even stupid in another area which is threatening to his self-appraisal. One of the characteristics of a neurotic, to the extent to which he is so, to the extent to which he lacks self-esteem, is that, in effect, when he comes up against any fact or any perception or any issue which is a potential threat to his pseudo-self-esteem, he counters, in effect, by making himself unconscious, by evading. And in so doing, he perpetuates the very process of psychoepistemological self-sabotaging which got him into trouble psychologically in the first place. And in this difference between the healthy man and the man of pseudo-self-esteem, one can see one interesting index to mental health and illness. A man is psychologically healthy to the extent that there is no clash in him between perceiving reality and preserving his self-esteem. The degree to which such a clash exists is the degree of his mental illness. Now, while evasion and repression are psychoepistemologically essential and basic to provide a neurotic with his illusion of self-esteem, that is only part of the process of self-deception in which he engages, only part of the process of self-fraud. The other part may be observed in the sort of values and goals he chooses as a means of achieving his sense of personal worth. What does he tie his self-esteem to? In the process of choosing values, ladies and gentlemen, there is a fundamental difference in principle between the motivation of a man of self-esteem and of pseudo-self-esteem. An individual who develops healthily derives his cardinal pleasure and his pride from the work of his mind and from the achievements which the work of his mind makes possible. Feeling confident of his ability to deal with the facts of reality, he will want a challenging, effortful, creative existence. Creativeness will be his highest love on whatever his level of intelligence. Feeling confident of his own value, he will be drawn to and attracted by self-esteem in others. What he will desire most in human relationships is the opportunity to feel admiration. He will want to find men and achievements he can respect. In the sphere both of his work and of human relationships, his base and motor is a firm sense of confidence, of efficacy, and as a consequence, a love for existence, a love for the fact of being alive. Now, how does this compare or rather contrast with the man of pseudo-self-esteem? The man without authentic self-esteem, or without it to a significant extent. That man's base and motor is not confidence, but fear. Not to live, but to escape his fear of life, this is his fundamental goal. Not creativeness, but safety is his ruling desire. And what he seeks from others is not the chance to experience admiration. No, what he seeks from others is an escape from moral values, an escape from moral judgment, a promise to be forgiven, to be accepted, to be taken care of metaphysically, to be comforted and protected in a terrifying universe. It's to such a man that the biblical quotation, "Judge not that you be not judged," is the one moral rule he is enthusiastically willing to follow. Now, a man's self-esteem or pseudo-self-esteem determines his abstract values, not the specific goals he will seek. Because his specific goals can proceed from a lot of different factors, such as a man's intelligence, his knowledge, his premises, his personal context. For instance, a man of high self-esteem will desire intellectually challenging work, but whether he chooses to enter business or science or art depends on narrower, less fundamental considerations. And similarly, a man of pseudo-self-esteem will desire that others protect him from reality, but a variety of factors will determine whether he feels more at home among the country club set, or the academic set, or the underworld set. And here we can see another interesting principle, another very important principle that differentiates mental health from mental illness. This time a principle observable in the sphere of motivation. A man of self-esteem is motivated by a love of self and of existence. A man of pseudo-self-esteem, to the extent of his lack of authentic self-esteem, is motivated by the fear that he is unfit for existence. The issue here then is motivation by confidence versus motivation by terror. A man is psychologically healthy to the extent that he functions on the principle of motivation by confidence. The degree of his motivation by fear is the degree of his mental illness. And now we come to a very important aspect of the psychology of the man of pseudo-self-esteem. And that is that such a man, in choosing his values, is motivated primarily not by the desire to afford himself a positive enjoyment of existence, but rather to defend himself against anxiety, against painful feelings of inadequacy, self-doubt, and guilt. So it may be said that he lives negatively or defensively. An analogy will help to make this principle clear. Say, if a man's life is in physical danger, for example, suppose he suffers from some major disease, why then his primary concern in such an emergency situation is obviously not with the pursuit of enjoyment, but with the removal of the danger, that is, with regaining his health, with reestablishing the context in which the pursuit of enjoyment will again be possible and appropriate. But to the man devoid of self-esteem, life is, in effect, a chronic emergency. He is always in danger psychologically. He never reaches normality. He never feels free for the enjoyment of life, because his method of combating the danger consists not of dealing with it rationally, not of working to remove it, but of seeking to persuade himself that it does not exist, that there is no danger. Since facts are facts and are not to be wiped out by self-made blindness, he doesn't succeed. But most of his evasions, repressions, and self-defeating actions are aimed at this goal. Fear is the ruling element in this man's psychology. Fear rules him psychoepistemologically, and fear rules him motivationally. Psychoepistemologically, fear acts to undercut the clarity of his perception, to distort his judgments, to restrict his cognitive ambition, and to drive him into ever-increasing evasions. Fear rules him motivationally in that it subverts his normal value development, sabotages his proper growth, and leads him toward goals that promise to support his pretense at efficacy, driving him to passive conformity or hostile aggressiveness or autistic withdrawal, to any path, to any escape route that will protect his pseudo-self-esteem against a stern, unknown, and unforgiving reality. I have coined a name to characterize the values which a person adopts as devices to protect himself from anxiety. I call them defense values. And I mean by a defense value one motivated by fear and aimed at supporting a pseudo-self-esteem. A defense value is one motivated by fear and aimed at supporting a pseudo-self-esteem. It is experienced in effect as a means of survival, as a substitute for rationality. It is an anti-anxiety device. Now, not all defense values are irrational intrinsically. What can be irrational about them is only the reason why this person chose them. For example, productive work is a rational value, but escaping into work as a means of evading one's flaws, shortcomings, and conflicts is not rational. Often, however, defense values are irrational in both respects. They're irrational in themselves and irrational in the motive for adopting them, as, for example, in the case of a man who seeks to escape anxiety and fake a sense of efficacy by acquiring power over others. Some months ago, writing on the issue of pseudo-self-esteem in the Objectivist newsletter, I projected a dramatized case history to show how a pseudo-self-esteem might develop. And I couldn't do better extemporaneously than to remind you of the portrait which I devised to illustrate this particular case. It's not based upon a single patient, it's actually a composite from my own past clinical experience. But I want to quote this because it's the simplest way to dramatize for you how defense values and pseudo-self-esteem develop, how they become, in effect, the building blocks of one's soul. Quote, "Consider the case of a person who, as a child, is characteristically antipathetic to exerting mental effort, who rebels against the responsibility of thinking, who resents the necessity of judgment, who prefers an undemanding state of mental fog, and drifts at the mercy of unexamined emotions. Whenever feelings of inadequacy or anxiety penetrate his chronic lethargy, warning him of the danger of his course, he seeks to evade them as best he can. He clings to the guidance and authority of those around him in order to obtain a sense of security and protection. As a result of his policy of unquestioning obedience, his parents praise him as a good boy. At school, his work is mediocre, and he feels an unadmitted resentment against the brighter boys in his class. He is pleased whenever they show signs of unruliness and are chastised by the teacher. This proves, he feels, that they are not good boys, and that, notwithstanding his intellectual weakness, he is their moral superior. He enjoys going to church, where he is informed that it is not the head that matters, but the heart, and that the meek shall inherit the earth. As he grows to adulthood, he is seldom conscious of the steps by which he selects his values and goals. But, moving like a somnambulist under the direction of subconscious orders, he is guided through all his crucial decisions by his unacknowledged sense of impotence, his fear of independence, his longing for safety, and his antipathy to thought. These lead him unerringly to choose friends of undistinguished intelligence, to accept a job in his uncle's hardware store, to join the same political party as his father, and to marry the girl next door whom he has known all his life. Whenever he feels vaguely guilty over his inertia, or whenever his wife reproaches him for his lack of ambition and nags him to demand a raise, he responds by summoning the thought that he is a decent citizen, a good provider, a devoted, faithful husband, a God-fearing man, and that he has done all the things one is supposed to do. Whenever he feels a surge of envy or hostility toward those men around him who have made more of their lives than he has, he tells himself that his cardinal virtue is humility, and that people are at fault in not recognizing this and giving him the respect he deserves. It is thus that he makes his existence tolerable psychologically. At the hardware store, he performs the routine tasks he has been taught, initiating nothing, learning nothing, thinking nothing. But occasionally he dreams of the higher income and enhanced prestige he will enjoy when his uncle dies and leaves him the business. If the moral implications of his wish rise to trouble him, he promptly unfocuses his mind and thus eludes them. However, when the longed-for event finally happens, he does not experience the elation he had imagined. A day after his uncle's funeral, he awakens in the middle of the night, his heart pounding frantically, in a state of acute dread. He does not know how to account for it. He knows only that he feels overwhelmed by a sense of impending disaster. The evasion and self-deception which have been habitual since childhood now forbid him to know the meaning of his anxiety. For years, he had been shrinking his perception and the dimensions of the world with which he had to deal in order to avoid coming face to face with his moral and psychological default and to escape any potential threat to his precarious inner security. He has crawled through his life, accepting, nodding, agreeing, obeying, seeking to bypass the effort and responsibility of thought by making humility his means of survival, seeking to establish for himself a world in which this would be possible. But now reality has demolished the walls of that world. He has been thrown into a situation where intellectual responsibility will be demanded of him, where he will have to exercise judgment. Two thoughts have collided within him. I've got to know what to do, and I can't. In response to this collision, the chronic fear he had always evaded explodes into terror. The terror of the knowledge that his defense values are now inadequate to protect him, and that there is no longer any place to run. Just as a rational, psychologically healthy man bases his self-esteem on the use of his mind and gains an ever-increasing sense of control over his existence by choosing values that demand constant intellectual growth, so this man based his pseudo-self-esteem on his humility, counting on others to solve the problem of his survival, and chose values appropriate to this manner of existence, values intended to reassure him of the validity and safety of his course. The terror he feels when he assumes ownership of the hardware store is the terror of a man suddenly divested of his means of survival, who must act and function in reality without weapons. Close quote. One of the significant characteristics of defense values is that they are usually held very compulsively. That is, men will hang on to them, defying reason, defying logic, clinging to them as a life preserver in the stormy sea. They feel as though they're hanging over an abyss, and all that's protecting them is their defense values. Let them go, and they collapse into the abyss of fully knowing the extent to which they lack self-esteem, the extent of their psychological and moral failure. And to escape the agony of this state, men will pay just about any price. They will defy logic, they will sacrifice their practical self-interest, sometimes they will even forfeit their lives. I've said they will pay just about any price. Well, with rare exceptions, any price except the one that could save them. They will not acknowledge the fraudulence of their defenses and work to achieve an authentic self-esteem. There is an almost unlimited variety in the possible defense values which men can adopt. Most of them, however, fall into one broad category. They are values generally held in high regard by the culture or subculture in which a person lives. There are many examples of defense values, and I will give you just a little sprinkling, as it were. Think of the man who is obsessed with being popular, who feels driven to win the approval of every person he meets, who clings to the image of himself as a likable guy, who in effect regards his appealing personality as his means of survival, as the proof of his personal worth. Think of the woman who has no sense of personal identity and who seeks to lose her inner emptiness in the role of a sacrificial martyr for her children, demanding in exchange only that her children adore her, that their adoration fill the vacuum of the ego she doesn't possess. Or think of the man who never forms independent judgments about anything, but who seeks to compensate by making himself authoritatively knowledgeable concerning other men's opinions about everything. Of course, in school today, we are all taught or encouraged to do this. The man who works at being aggressively masculine, whose other concerns are entirely subordinated to his role as a woman chaser, and who derives less pleasure from the act of sex than from the act of reporting his adventures to the boys in the locker room. Think of, and there are a great many examples of this today, the man who feels guilt over having inherited a fortune, who has no idea of what to do with it and proceeds frantically to give it away, clinging to the ideal of altruism and to the vision of himself as a humanitarian, keeping his pseudo-self-esteem afloat by the belief that charity is a moral substitute for competence and courage. The person who has always been afraid of life and who tells himself that the reason is his superior sensitivity, and who chooses his clothes, his furniture, his books, and his bodily posture by the standard of what will make him appear idealistic. Yes, the examples are almost endless. Among defense values, of course, many are to be found in religion. Obedience to some religious injunction is often made the basis of pseudo-self-esteem. Faith in God, asceticism, systematic self-abnegation, adherence to religious rituals are among the commoner devices employed to allay anxiety and purchase a sense of worthiness. One loses oneself in the rituals or the obedience that one shares with one's fellows. Still another variant is the person who bases his pseudo-self-esteem upon his aspirations, who tells himself that what he does in reality or doesn't do, that doesn't count. That's not the real me. What's the real me? It's my intentions, my inarticulate dreams, my longings, my aspirations. He bases his pseudo-self-esteem upon being an aspirer. If you ask him, well, why can't you do anything about this in your actual life and reality? He shrugs and says, well, what can you do? It's the system. It's circumstances. It's human infirmity. I never had the chance. I never got the break. Now, in the case above, I took the basic pattern of a man's life from the early formation of defense values to the breakdown in anxiety attack. Now, defense values and pseudo-self-esteem don't always or necessarily break down in so violent and dramatic a form. Often, the process is quieter, but no less devastating. The process of psychological erosion and disintegration is more insidious. The person involved is not brought to any moment, to any single moment of unmistakable crisis. No, it doesn't happen that way. Rather, his energy is slowly drained. He finds himself becoming increasingly more subject to depression, to fatigue, perhaps to a variety of physical complaints. His pretense at self-value becomes progressively more frayed and worn, and his life peters out in a kind of empty, meaningless, desolate misery, without climaxes, without explosions, with just a quiet, lethargic wonder as to what had gone wrong where. Just an increasing sense of spiritual tiredness and grayness. That is perhaps the commonest pattern of all. No evasion, no defense values, No strategy of self-deception can ever provide a man with a substitute for authentic self-esteem. The sense of efficacy and virtue men long for cannot be purchased by any of the self-frauds they perpetrate. Man needs the conviction that he is right for reality, right in principle, and only an unbreached rationality can achieve it. He can adopt any of the standard devices. He can spend half his life on his knees praying. He can make endless contributions to charity. He can offer sacrifice after sacrifice. He can become the biggest woman chaser who ever lived, or abstain entirely. And all he's going to achieve at best is a moment's self-forgetfulness or a partial anesthetizing of the anxiety, a diminution of the feeling of dread, but whatever illusion of relief, whatever temporary amelioration of guilt, whatever quieting of despair he may reach, he is not going to know, he is not going to achieve self-esteem. The tragedy of most men's lives come from their attempts to escape this fact. Most men, as I said earlier, don't think about any of these issues in conscious conceptual terms. They just live and they cut a corner here and they cut a corner there and they evade here and they blank out there and they follow the line of least resistance here. It's a process of gradual attrition, of giving up one's life piece by piece, not imagining that all of those evasions and betrayals will ever add up, but they do add up. They do add up. There's a bookkeeper, as it were, inside every human mind that keeps an infallible record of every act of moral treason, of every evasion, of every attempt to place an I wish above an it is. And if you don't know it on the conscious level, you know it through your emotions, through the damned unpleasant nature of too many of one's emotions. There is, in effect, an accumulated score being kept because every time that you, for good or for ill, let me hasten to add, every time that a man exerts the effort of thinking and grasps something new, he adds to the capital of his self-confidence. Every time he acts on his best rational understanding and resists any emotional pressure, he adds to his sense of efficacy and worth. And by the same logic and for the same reasons, any time that he acts against it, he chips away at his self-esteem. Now, there is one pattern of attempting to escape the problem of self-esteem which is immensely prevalent. It's one particular variety of pseudo-self-esteem, one broad category of defense values, which are so important psychologically and culturally that they deserve a separate lecture. The issue deserves a separate lecture. And that is the broad category which includes all those people who try in one form or another to solve the problem of self-esteem, not through the rational exercise of their minds, but rather through their relationships to other people. All the people who try to derive their sense of self-value from their human relationships, most commonly from the approval of others. All those whose pseudo-self-esteem is tied in one form or another to satisfying the values, the terms, the conditions, the judgments of others. I'm speaking, of course, of the phenomenon to which I have given the name social metaphysics. Many of you will be familiar with this term, but in any event, I won't go into a definition of it and why I call a phenomenon social metaphysics until next week. But one point I do want to make now. Social metaphysics is only one type of character neurosis. It's by far the commonest, and it includes more people than any other single type. But since students often ask me whether or not all defense values are social metaphysical in nature, I want to say no, they are not. The mere fact that you have failed to achieve healthy self-esteem doesn't necessarily mean that you will seek it from your relationships with others. This is really the commonest anti-anxiety device which is adopted, and one which has immense cultural importance today. And because of its widespread nature, and because of its social and cultural importance, as I said, I want to give a whole lecture over to the subject. And therefore, next week, I shall be concerned with specifically the psychology of those whose self-esteem is tied to their relationships with other human beings. And so, to be continued.